Good evening, everybody. So very good to have you here with us tonight as we are able to study 1 Timothy chapter 3. I guess one of the good things about being online is that the weather doesn't slow us down like it sometimes can happen. Did a little bit of trivia before there, so we're just kind of talking about some of the names of Bible parents and Bible children. And King Manasseh had a son, and his son was also the father of Josiah. And maybe you remember King Ammon, who didn't last very long. He only ruled 2 years before he died, and his son Josiah became the king at 8 years old. So kind of an interesting little tidbit for us to consider there. I'm always amazed. I always think I have a hard question, and everybody just kind of throws me out. But probably half of us are thinking, one person knew that answer, and the rest of us are just thinking, I'd have never thought it, and maybe we just feel shy about it. But I'm sure there's always a Bible fact somebody knows that somebody else doesn't. So that's just one of the interesting things about playing a little bit of trivia before we get started. Get your Bibles out, though. Let's go over to the book of 1 Timothy chapter 3. 1 Timothy chapter 3. And we're in the middle of talking about the appointment of the overseers in the church. And you'll remember how we were talking about these things and that these qualifications, these characteristics we've been talking about. One of the things that we've hopefully kind of sat in on and has really kind of become something we're focused on is that these are characteristics that all Christians are striving to obtain, striving to achieve. Now, there's some of them like children or marriage that maybe not all of us have, but the point is that there are things about spiritual maturity that we all are pursuing. So that's an important thing that we should consider, that we're all pursuing these things. So that being said, as we pick up in these characteristics, I think last time we had ended right at the characteristic that spoke here. Actually, let's just grab the Bible first before we look too far. Oops, I was looking at some of those trivia questions myself earlier. So as we were looking at these things, and we had talked about verse 2, the bishop must be blameless, the husband of one wife, temperate, sober-minded, good behavior, hospitable, able to teach. Last time we were talking about these things, we had been looking at the characteristic of being of good behavior. We talked about how that good behavior, respectable, I think I mentioned to you that it comes with the word for cosmos. You're familiar with the word cosmos. It's the idea of the order of things, that somebody's behavior, their abilities are well taken care of and such. And so we were considering those things last time. So let's move on to the next one. And if you have any comments at any time, we'll grab them and throw them up. And the next qualification of an overseer is that he is to be hospitable. Hospitable. Now, let's go ahead and first of all say hospitality is something all of us are supposed to pursue. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 2 makes a commandment to all of us to be hospitable. The word hospitable is kind of interesting in the Greek language. Philoxenos. You don't have to be much of a Greek language person to kind of recognize some words there. You might know philo is kind of like that brotherly love. Xenos is the person who's foreign or separate from everybody else. So it's a love of foreigners or a love of strangers. In Strong, he says, fond of guests. It's somebody who has the desire, the affection for people that are strangers, that aren't known to them. Now, as we kind of would use the term, I kind of would prefer to kind of think of it like that. We might say it's the idea of having an open home. People are invited in, people are, allowed to participate in your life. Even though we oftentimes try to diminish some of the social aspects of spiritual behavior, we do want to say, though, that it's important here that we understand that this is a characteristic that we need to have. It's something all of us need to work on, right? We need to be more in each other's homes and lives. But one thing the Bible is clear is that somebody who's going to oversee the church, they're required to have people in their lives. Tell me this, what do you think about that idea? Specifically, can you see some of the benefits and wisdom of this command, of this qualification, that a man and his wife that are supposed to be overseers in the church, that they have to have a home that's open to others? What kind of benefits can you see from that? Because I can see a few things that kind of fall into a sense of, well, that makes sense. That's kind of a practical thing. Stan Malore says, Stan's actually taking us over to Hebrews 13 and verse 2, which talks about the command for hospitality. And in that command, there's a reminder that some people have entertained angels unaware. And of course, that's probably referring to either Lot in his home or Abraham, who back in the book of Genesis had entertained angels. So that's kind of an interesting thing. And it's a neat statement in Hebrews 13 and verse 2. You never know who you invited into your home. So I enjoy that idea. But can you think of maybe, as I said, some of the values or the reasons why this qualification really makes sense? Maybe it's something to say this is why we would want somebody who's hospitable. Debbie's got a great one right off the top. Debbie Root says, well, they're commanded to know their flock. That's fantastic, Debbie. One of the important ideas, we know when Jesus was talking about the shepherd in John 10, he says, my sheep, they know my voice and I know them. Jesus was talking about what it meant to be a good shepherd, and he was talking about that close relationship he had with them. And Debbie's point here, she says, that necessity of knowing the people that you're serving in that sense is vital. I mean, you probably could fairly say, how could you serve other people, serve the church, if you really don't know them and they really don't know you? You don't know what they need. And, our interaction at church, as wonderful as it is, it's pretty minimal. 30 minutes a week, 15 before, 15 after kind of thing. And that's not serious interaction. That's not a very useful interaction. And so it's important that that's the case. So Debbie gives us a great one right off the top. Grant kind of follows up with a very similar point. They need to know everyone in the congregation. And that's fantastic. That's, again, grabs this idea that they need to personally know people. You need to know what they need. You need to know what they struggle with. Those are important ideas. So Stephen kind of takes it a little different direction. I like this, Stephen. Stephen's statement is, he says, an open home to others encourages some to seek help, perhaps. Now, Stephen, I was thinking along the lines of the idea that one of the things about that open home is it makes people comfortable bearing our sins with one another. We have a sense of a familiarity that makes us more likely to have serious conversations with each other. I really like that point. Debbie says entertaining people in a more personal setting lets us know people better so we can help them. That's perfect. And by the way, that's why all of us need to work on hospitality, because we really need to know one another. How many times do I use the illustration to say, if on the day of judgment, God says, your brother, your sister in Christ had a terrible need and you never helped them. And you were to say, well, I never knew. Well, Jesus might say, well, why weren't you more hospitable then, so that you would have known? That's what it's supposed to be about. Here's a point that Lamar makes. He says, elders being hospitable gives the opportunity to witness how they rule their own houses and have an open life for others to witness how they live. Now, Lamar, that's actually the first thing that pops in my mind. That one of the things about having an open home is that you observe how that person conducts himself. Now, Lamar, what I think that's so significant is I think as we move along to some of these qualifications, how many of these qualifications require us to have a knowledge of that person, to know, especially when we get down a little further at verse 4 and 5, when it talks about, how they rule in their home, how they oversee their own home. How would we know if they don't have an open home for us to see these things? It's important to see, and I guess, the danger is, that people want to put on a facade sometimes and kind of hide the problems they have. But it's important for us to see how people conduct themselves. So Lamar's point is, one of the reasons why hospitality makes so much sense is that it's the way that we know somebody actually fits the qualifications. We need to be in their home. We need to see what's going on. He's going to talk about here in verse 3 about not being given to wine. We need to know what's in their refrigerator. Those are things that are reasonable that we need to know. We need to understand, meaning we need to know that they, uphold these characteristics and don't stumble in sin. We need to be in their life. And for them to know us, they need to be in ours. And that's why hospitality is so important. Now, Lindsay kind of takes it a little different direction. Lindsay, I like this comment. You said, serving others helps maintain humility and shows love. And of course, that's what the word means, right? The love of stranger, but it's the idea that it's people I may not know well. I want to get to know them. I want to make them cease to be a stranger. Of course, our great examples of hospitality. We think of Abraham. That was kind of Stan's point earlier when he was reminding us out of Hebrews 13 and verse 2. Abraham sees the strangers walking by. He stops them. He insists they come in. He's going to wash their feet. He's going to feed them. He really just kind of goes, all out for these people. That's an important idea for us. Teresa says, remember, hospitality is not just sharing a meal. It's the open home, giving others the opportunity to feel protection and encouragement. And that's a great thing to think about. That's the fantastic idea that we need to consider, is that idea that the open home, and you're right, Teresa, it's not just a meal. And that's why, by the way, there's no way the church can fulfill hospitality. In other words, it's not a work of the church to provide meals for people. It's the work of Christians to have homes that are open to provide not just food, but the things that are needed, or just an environment to open and express themselves. So that's really a great thing. Linda took it in a direction I wasn't thinking about, but this is nice. Linda says, well, how about the opportunity to teach someone who doesn't know the Lord? Fantastic, by the way. And I would suggest that there's probably a lot of people who have come to know God based on the good works of others in being hospitable. So that's a fantastic point to think about, and it speaks more to the general requirement that all of us need to have in hospitality. So when you consider hospitality, this this is a fascinating way to put it. I got a comment here from Grant. I'm going to have to pull Grant's comment up because Grant, YouTube did not like your comment. It believes that it might have been violating their terms. And Grant, it won't let me bring your comment up either. I don't know why you got in trouble with YouTube on this comment. I'm going to read you Grant's comment. It's not showing up for any of you. It says, sometimes someone hospitable to non-Christians probably has a better reputation in the world. Now, that's a neat comment. I have no idea why YouTube flagged it. That's a neat comment, though. And what's neat about that comment is that we're going to be finishing up here in verse 7 that you must have a good testimony with those who are out of the outside. So that's interesting to say that the hospitality shown both to the believer and the unbeliever, that kindness, that generosity is part of that good reputation you have among others. So that really is a neat point that you have there, Grant. It's too bad, like I said, I can't get it to show up for some reason. It says I cannot moderate the video owner. I don't know. Sometimes it baffles me. Stan makes the statement, I've had the opportunity to work with several Christians and had to live as a Christian all the time. It is interesting to say this. When we're around Christians, in a non-church setting, a lot of times we're getting an experience of who they are that may or may not reflect what we've seen about them in worship. And again, that's one of the important reasons why we're examining the elders for these things. Lamar makes the statement, hospitality then would mean more intimacy than what we think of today. They were really in each other's lives daily and knew each other in all these character traits. Lamar, I suspect that's true. And when I say suspect, I believe it to be true, that the concepts of hospitality in the Middle East, even to this day, have a stronger sense of things than we have it. In other words, in our society, if somebody's passing through and traveling, our presumption is they've planned ahead for their food, their travel, things like that. But in ancient times, that wasn't the case, and it was the custom of most people that that the stranger came and you were to provide for them, because then likewise they would do so for you. So that's an important point, Lamar, that it really was much stronger than we might think of. But what's interesting, Lamar, is I would suggest that it really is trying to give us a sense, particularly of hospitality among brethren and among one another, that maybe we should pursue these stronger relationships and these stronger ways of working with one another and being with one another. I remember years ago, I was studying with somebody about this, and they were studying with me, talking about these things, and they made the statement to say hospitality is a terribly overlooked qualification. And I just think it's important to say that, we all need to pursue the idea of having homes that we are comfortable having each other in. Sometimes people say, "Oh, I don't want to have people in my house. It's dirty." That's not a good answer. Because particularly that almost comes across as vanity sometimes. But the bigger idea is, for the largest part, probably most people don't care. Most people are just, glad to have that interaction with people. So, as I said, you see a lot of good wisdom in all these comments that you made here. They all reflect a really good wisdom as to why it is the case that that this is one of the qualifications given to overseers. Of course, we're not really a people that sit down and say we only like the qualifications that make sense to us. This is important, though, because we can see a lot of reasons for this qualification. You need to know each other. The overseer needs to know the congregation. The congregation needs to know the overseer, needs to bear witness of the life he lives, whether it's something, an example to follow, or whether it disqualifies him from that work. And then, of course, we talk more generally about hospitality among all of us, that we're all pursuing the idea of serving one another in this very humble way. Next qualification, still found in verse 2. After good behavior and hospitable, the next qualification we have is being able to teach. I know some translations use the expression apt to teach. Yeah, the Greek word there is a word that we sometimes use even in our language, didactic. You probably say, I've never used didactic in my life. Fair enough. But didactic just means the idea of you're teaching, you're passing information one person to another. It's not like the general Bible study where we're all making comments and stuff. It's one person who's trying to express to another person an idea. They're trying to get them to see something or learn something. Didos, di meaning two, this idea of the action that goes between two people. So in this conversation about being able to teach, there's a lot that you could discuss about this idea. You might consider in 2 Timothy chapter 2, he speaks about the servant of God. I believe in that case we're talking about the evangelist, also being somebody who is apt or able to teach as a requirement. But of course, we also know Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 12 is a passage that says all of us ought to pursue the idea of being able to teach. And you remember actually it's probably now 2 years ago, we did this study on how to be a teacher and talked about a lot of the biblical principles of teaching. And one of the things we talked about was contrasting Hebrews 5 with James 3 and James' statement that not many ought to be teachers. That the issue is that we all ought to pursue the ability to pass information from one person to another, but a lot of us aren't successful or haven't really prioritized those things and therefore aren't really capable or ought to be fulfilling that work. But it's the idea, like I said, that we're passing information. And I'm always kind of interesting how you might describe this, but I've often suggested that this probably doesn't mean the idea just that somebody can get up in a class setting and teach a class. That it probably means as well the idea of sitting one-on-one with somebody and engaging with them in a very private way. So if there's an elder who's not very good at a class presentation, they don't get up and they don't speak well or they don't present well, but they're very good about sitting down with people and talking with them in a very small setting. They would probably, at least from my estimation, would fulfill this obligation to be apt to teach. They would fulfill that thought. If you have any other thoughts on that, I'd love to hear some of those things. Stan's got a comment. I think Stan's comment speaks more to the last point about hospitality. He says, when you know someone, you'll not be so quick to misunderstand them. Stan, that's a really important statement. And by the way, Stan, let's add that. Let's kind of step back for a second and add that to the list of why it makes good sense. And that is to say that if the brethren know the overseers well, that's the overseer's benefit, that they're more likely, if they say something that comes across odd, that the confidence brethren have in them oftentimes dismisses those things as a misunderstanding that's really, and vice versa, towards brethren, that those are important things. So Stan's comment is actually really, really good when you think about what that is, always thinking positive thoughts. So Teresa says there are many ways to teach. Leading a group class is one-on-one, as opportunity arises. So Teresa, that's how I see it. The idea that we're supposed to, that being apt to teach may not always mean, the idea the person who stands up in front of a group of people, which is the kind of teaching that a lot of times we're familiar with. But it could be like Jesus with the woman at the well, or with Nicodemus in John 3 and John 4. It can be just these little groups where Jesus pulls aside a couple of his disciples and talks to them, like in Matthew 17. There's lots of ways we can discuss Jesus as the teacher. And the big idea there is that as a teacher, Jesus taught a lot of different ways. And that is an important point. Stan quotes 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15. He says, always ready to give an answer to the hope that lies within us. Stan, I do think that that's a good description of the concept of what it fundamentally means to be apt to teach, that you're ready to give an answer. Along that line, I want to jump over to Titus for just a second, and I want you to think of the ability of apt to teach in contrast to the language in Titus. You remember Titus 1 is our parallel passage, right? Titus 1 is the qualifications given for the elders given to Titus. So same work, same office, same qualifications, but that little bit of different wording helps us to kind of get a fuller idea of these things. And I would suggest to you, when we consider teaching, look at what Titus is told. He says, holding fast to the faithful word as he has been taught. So he's somebody who holds fast to the word, that he may be able by sound doctrine both to exhort and convict those who contradict. What is the term used in the King James Version? Is it gainsayer, naysayer? The language is the idea of somebody who's skeptical or who's not convinced that the elder is supposed to be somebody. An elder is supposed to be somebody who has the ability to express the word of God in a way that exhorts or convicts those who either need an exhortation to walk faithfully or need to be convicted that they're not walking faithfully. So I think Titus chapter 1 and verse 9 gives us a nice explanation of part of the reasoning for this qualification. And I really like to consider that passage as I look at these things. Gainsayer, that's it. Teresa, like I said, I can't remember, naysayer pops in my mind a lot too, but it's gainsayer. I appreciate that. Rob makes the statement. Rob says, teaching by example is often overlooked as teaching. And that is important, Rob. In fact, I would say that the living example is probably, for most Christians, the most important way that they evangelize by works like hospitality, patience, the very descriptions we've kind of been going through, that this is something that oftentimes convicts people or teaches people. I would suggest to you that probably some of the most important teaching that parents pass on to their children is teaching by their conduct. Your kids learn how to speak from you, what words not to use or to use, and, how to find godly mates, or how to find, a place in the church. Those are things that they learn from us. So it's important that we understand the idea that, like Rob says, we teach a lot by our behavior. In fact, those are probably the loudest lessons we teach. So that's a good comment there, Rob. Teresa makes a side note. She says, well, Jesus taught by asking questions and things like saying, let him who is without sin cast the first stone. Jesus' method of teaching, and we talked about this a couple of years ago, really is fascinating because he taught at a lot of levels. He would teach to the big groups. He would teach to a small group. He'd teach one-on-one. He taught to hostile audiences. He taught, just a whole variety of things. And he would use different tactics and techniques in different groups. So one of the things you point out is that, and by the way, Teresa, I think that we might say that Jesus asking questions oftentimes was done when the audience was either difficult people, their attitude or behavior was difficult, or it might have been people that had the completely wrong ideas, and rather than, just tell them you're wrong, he would ask them questions that would make them observe their own error that the things they needed to think about. So it's interesting how Jesus used questions, or how he used these really remarkable statements like the one you point out to kind of get people to think differently. The point of being the teacher isn't the idea that we're trying to show people we know a lot. We're trying to exhort and convict somebody who contradicts. A lot of times whenever, we're going to talk to somebody, we have to think about the idea of not just saying the thing that needs to be said, to say this is what's true and that's that. We need to say to ourselves, what's the best way that this person would receive that? You think of Paul on Mars Hill, right? What? The truth was they were lost idolaters. But if you got up in front of people and said, you're just a bunch of lost idolaters, they wouldn't have listened. So he expressed to them characteristics of something that they understood better. And in the end, there was at least one Areopagite that obeyed the gospel, and he had some success in doing that. I think it's a great lesson for all of us. One more comment here. Stan says, having an elder visit each of the classes, they can ensure that the students and the teacher are on track with the Bible. So that's a good practical advice, observation for us to consider. And that really is an important thing for us to think about. So good point. Very good point. We'll pick up on the next one. You still got comments on this. We'll grab them. We'll take a look at them. But our next one that we're looking at, number 10, begins verse 3, not given to wine. Not given to wine. Kind of interesting, and I'm going to be honest, one of the things that I struggle to understand is the contrast between the wording here and the wording in verse 8. Really, it seems to be the same, but I'm not sure why it's slightly different. I would suggest to you, though, really it's probably the identical point. It's kind of interesting here in this characteristic. The very word here has a very specific point to say that they're not even near wine. I think of the Nazirite vow that we talked about in the book of Numbers a few weeks ago, and how that Nazirite vow required that the Nazirites couldn't even consume things that you could make into alcohol. They couldn't even eat grapes, for example. I don't think that's, by the way, I don't think that's what he means, but I am saying that that's how abstaining they were from these things. We want to understand that Christians, we talked about this in a lesson a few weeks ago, Christians don't drink. The consumption of alcohol is contrary to the things of Christ. And we understand that, again, one of the things of the overseer is he models the virtues, the characteristics that Christians are to put on. So it's a great place for us to understand that this is something that a Christian is pursuing, is the idea that they're not imbibing, they're not partaking in alcoholic drinks. And so this is a great place for us to consider this point. Ephesians 5 verse 18 says, don't be drunk with wine. He says, which is dissipation. He says, instead be filled with the Spirit. When we talked about this lesson a few weeks ago about Christians don't drink, that one of the characteristics we talked about in that passage was dissipation is the idea of an evaporation of spiritual conditions and spiritual mindsets. So this one is important. And as I said, I would suggest to you that we really don't really have a difference between this and the deacon in verse 8. And one of the other ideas is that all Christians are pursuing this characteristic, this virtue, this point. I don't see anybody has any comments on this, so we can go ahead and move on. I like to think it's because, boy, I just recently heard this great lesson, and it answered every question I have about it. Okay, maybe you didn't. But, sometimes these are questions you might say, I don't want to ask it out loud because, what if everybody gets upset with me? And I would hope that we wouldn't, but at the same time, always you can shoot me an email. I'd be glad to hear from you. You had questions on this on your own. Stephen James points to overindulgence in wine in the New American Standard. His statement is that certainly is a. Let me grab your statement there, Stephen. It's certainly overindulgence in wine. So that's kind of an interesting point that we consider there. So you have New American Standard there, Stephen. I have it as not addicted to wine. So I'm not sure if I'm using the too old of the NASB. They revised the NSV, the New American Standard Bible back in the mid-'80s. So sometimes it does read a little differently. That's kind of confusing. Stan Malore says, I do not think it's what the scripture means, but I have met members who believe that an elder cannot take any medicine that had alcohol in it. That's interesting, Stan. I'd agree. That almost certainly wouldn't be what the passage is speaking about or discussing. But of course, I could understand somebody's thought on that. But certainly, I don't think that could be reasonable, because at some point, one of the issues of intoxication is that there's a time for an intoxicant to be applied. If I'm going into surgery, I'm not going to say, well, if I'm an elder, I would rather not be put out. Don't knock me out. Just, operate on my heart with me awake. I think all of us would agree that that's probably some poor reasoning that might arrive at that conclusion. But very interesting, Stan. I appreciate you sharing that. Here's Teresa's comment. She says, even beyond the obvious, there's so many reasons not to, such as influence. It leads to other problems, such as addictions, etc. Absolutely, Teresa. This is the thing. It's funny. A lot of people have said, I'm not sure whether or not I can see that drinking is wrong, but I know that it destroys my influence with other people. It absolutely does. Absolutely does. And by the way, Teresa, one of the things we're always mindful as Christians, to stay away from people when they're drinking, because, even that association is something that destroys influence or leads to other problems as well. It really is a terrible thing to think about. So we'll go ahead and pick up on the next point then. And as I said, if you've got any other comments, throw them out there. We'll grab them as soon as we can. The next one he points out, it's kind of interesting. He talks about here in the New King James, not violent. Now, he kind of says this a little bit further on as well, as he talks about these things, as he talks about their characteristic and their behavior, but not violent, and then about 3 points on, not quarrelsome. And so if we want to kind of talk about both of those ideas here, some of the distinction here might be the idea of a person who is physically obsessed with fighting and things like that, and a person who's just argumentative. You know what I mean? Somebody who's just belligerent. The term belligerent means somebody who wants to have war. It's kind of the person who wants to start a war or cause a war. The term in Latin is belligerent. Let's talk first about the person that incites violence. Of course, part of our thinking is, well, yeah, nobody would want a violent person. I've wondered sometimes, though, but what about the person that just, they like to watch fights, or they enjoy fighting? I'm going to say that I enjoy watching old war movies and things like that. I'm not sure that would be, something that, characterizes somebody as a pugilist or as a fighter, but, sometimes the obsession with violence can be a dangerous thing, too. What about people that like to have hobbies where they're, if they took up boxing or things like that? Those might be kind of in a gray area of these things. Certainly there are times where I think some of those things cross a line, and other times they don't. I think a lot of that would be, our own understanding of these things. Stephen James reads, not a bully. Stephen, you've got an interesting translation there. It says NASB, but is NASB 2020? Is there a new version of that? I'll have to look into that. I didn't know that, Stephen. So it's kind of interesting, the language, not a bully. I like that point there, because it kind of gives us a sense of something interesting. Lamar says, not violent is a trait that comes out in difficult situations. They're never to respond with physical violence, but in a calm and gentle way that may convict the one of the situation that needs help. It's kind of interesting to consider that. And Lamar, maybe the only thing I would say is that there might be a time when a physical confrontation requires somebody to respond with a physical way. But I certainly would agree with you that it really is something that comes out in critical moments. As I said, this idea of somebody who's quarrelsome or who's ready to fight at the drop of a hat, that person is certainly not qualified to do this important work. And also just the idea, as you say, that these are characteristics that oftentimes come out when people are overly worked up. Excuse me. Overly worked up, or characteristics like that. So that's a really good point. for us to consider. I've always felt that, it's dangerous to even to be a person that boasts about fighting, even if they don't fight much themselves, but to boast about it, to talk about, well, nobody, pushes me around or something like that too, might be some of that point as well. Debbie Root makes this statement. She says, well, a bully will lord over others. What's interesting about that word bully is that I think that would be a really profound way to describe someone who's overseeing a church, that if that person was a bully, that they weren't reasoning with members, they weren't, striving with members, they were just oppressing them. And like you say there, Debbie, that idea of lording over others, what an interesting observation. I think that really does fit nicely. Stan makes the point to say, not a person that is looking for fault in what someone has said. So Stan, I think that fits that idea of the argumentative person, who I was kind of going to say is in verse 3, the not quarrelsome or not contentious fits that nicely as he describes it. That the idea of somebody who, well, I always like Jude 16, right? Where he says, don't be a fault finder. A person that looks for faults, looks for things that are wrong to point out. That's a dangerous thing to be. And I would suggest that probably does disqualify somebody from this important work because, well, as I said, all of us are commanded not to be that kind of person in the book of Jude, who, just wants to bring others down, maybe for pride or maybe for envy or dislike. I don't know. There's a lot of different reasons, but I think that that's a really good comment. Teresa's comment. Teresa says, going along with this and not contentious would be not to push someone's buttons, trying to goad them into saying or doing something so it can be blamed on them. Good point. Very interesting point, huh? Kind of an itchy nose. I'm sorry. So that's a really good point for us to consider. Linda makes this statement. She says, linked with not giving wine, drinking often leads to bad behavior, fighting, arguing. What a great point. Linda, I was thinking a lot of these qualifications really are very tightly linked together, especially as we kind of move on to talk about, several of these things about, free from the love of money and taking care of your home. There's just a lot of things that are kind of drawn together, I think, as we go through here. And that's interesting you saw that you see the idea of being gentle versus not quarrelsome and not greedy, not covetous. I think those are all interesting points to consider. Gregor says NASB is, he's just answering my question. It's a new version from the Lowen Foundation. So Gregor, I didn't know anything about that. So that's very interesting. I'm going to have to look into that and see what some of those characteristics are about that. I appreciate that note about that. Lisa makes this statement, but are we supposed to fight violence with violence? In the thought of protecting ourselves, is that okay in the eyes of the Lord? What a great statement, Lisa. That's kind of what I was thinking about earlier. The idea of whether or not there's a place where we have an authority for, we could talk about self-defense, or we could talk about the idea of defending somebody else. Wow. How much time do I have? Maybe I'm going to run out the clock on this, but it's an important question. One thing we might consider is in the Old Testament, there were some very specific laws and rules about self-defense. You might remember, was it Exodus 32? I can't remember the chapter. Maybe somebody look that up and remind us if that's the case. No, it would have been 23 maybe. I can't remember now. But one of the conversations there in the book of Exodus spoke to the idea that if somebody was, coming into your home at night in the dark and you took their life, that was an excused condition because, you were protecting yourself, your home, your family, and it was understandable. He makes the statement, by the way, to go on to say that if somebody broke in your home during the daytime and you knew they weren't going to harm you, but you harmed them, you'd be guilty of murder. I've always found that as a fascinating way that the law of Moses kind of rightly divides on this idea. Let's consider, too, that in the New Testament, we might look at something like in the book of Luke, whenever Jesus and his apostles, right before they were arrested, Jesus is asking them about weapons, that they carried weapons with them. Peter points out that they had 2 swords among them. And I think that probably speaks the most to the language or the idea of, can a Christian defend their life if it's going to be harmed? And there seems to be some condition where we would say, they had those swords for that purpose, for the purpose of defending themselves or defending others. But conversely, there is the language too that says we turn the other cheek. More specifically, things like we don't resist the authorities, the worldly authorities, Romans chapter 13, etc. So the question of, going back to your question, fighting violence with violence, are there times where using violence is authorized? Well, a police officer, a soldier, we might suggest that some of those are works that a Christian can have that might entail a violent action of some kind. But we have to be very careful. I just can't say enough to say that if peace is ever the option, it ought to be the way we're going to pursue it. That, in other words, we ought to be people that above all things value peace and being harmless to the degree that we'd even let ourselves be hurt rather than to bring harm to others. But ultimately, I would say that we do have some place where there's some scriptural authority for defending ourselves or defending our family, defending somebody who's innocent. Those are ideas that are important as well. Oh, Stephen Root brings up the very comment I did, the apostles carrying sword. Stephen, that's in Luke 22, I think, where that comment is made. So, if somebody looked that up and threw it in our chat, that'd be great. Didn't see anybody brought up my passage in the Exodus, which probably means I gave you 2 wrong chapters, and that's okay. That's on me, but I appreciate that. Let me see here. Stan, I want to step back. Stan's comment that bad companions corrupt good morals, so can the very appearance of evil. That's a good point. Now, Teresa kind of steps back to this idea of being argumentative. Listen to this statement. She says, I experienced a man who taught adult classes and would purposely bring up controversial ideas because he enjoyed watching the arguments that arose. Not only would he not be qualified, but the elders should have put a stop to it and didn't. Teresa, I would agree. And of course, to some degree, the idea of asking questions and getting answers that are, I would say controversial. But I've often said that in any Bible class, if argumentation arises, the class has to be ended. You can't actually permit that kind of thing. Everything has to be done decently and in order. And, if there's not elders in a church, the members need to bring that to a close. I know I've had experiences where people became argumentative in class and I just said, we'll talk about it later. This isn't the time or place. Let's talk about this another time, because it's not a wholesome thing to do. Teresa, let me play with that point though, because Lisa's got the passage, and Lisa corrected me. Lisa says it's Matthew 26:51, not Luke 22. Well, I don't know why I thought Luke. So good job, Lisa. You get a Brian point for what we call stump the chump. When you accurately corrected me and I was wrong, you made it a good point. I'm proud of you for doing that. Oh no, maybe it is Luke 22. I'll still give you that point. Let's kind of though go back to this statement that Teresa has made. One thing I would like to suggest in the time that we have left is the concept of being argumentative. I'm going to say this, and I want all of you to take this to heart. Sometimes I'll be on Facebook and I'll look at a brother and sister in Christ make a comment about a political situation or something that's going on that's controversial, that has a lot of dangerous or strong opinions on it. And they should know that statement is going to provoke some reasonable people or some people that are just slightly less than reasonable to become argumentative. Well, that's not the way we're supposed to behave. This is an important thing. If you have a reasonable knowledge that you're going to say something that's going to cause, argumenting, that's not a word, arguing or argumentation of any kind, if you know that you're going to make a statement and some people are going to be offended, I tell you what, there's nothing worse than seeing a brother or sister in Christ start a statement with, I know this might offend some of you. Because if you know it's going to offend somebody, you should hold your tongue. You should not say it. There's lots of things that are volatile, that are liable to cause controversy or debate. And I mean, if it's important, if it's the law of Christ, that's one thing. But oftentimes it's just human things. It's politics. It's, opinions about, things that really have little importance. if you're making comments like that, if you're throwing stuff out maybe on the internet or elsewhere, and you have a reasonable knowledge that this might offend somebody, that you could stir up controversy, you should not do it. Teresa's point about a teacher in a class who's making comments that cause controversy because he thinks that's good somehow. I've known lots of people that think that way. I know sometimes my brethren say things, and my thought is, did you not know that that was going to upset some people? Did you not know that that was going to cause people to get frustrated or upset because you said something that was politically charged or, in some other way? When I say politics, I mean the broad spectrum of the idea. We're supposed to live in peace with one another. If at all possible, Romans chapter 12, Romans chapter 13 speaks of it all possible. Live in peace with all people. I love the fact that we're kind of tying this to qualifications of overseers, because it's important that all of us are doing things and walking carefully. Everybody has opinions. One of the things we ought to esteem about our opinions is they're not that important. Oftentimes. And not everybody needs to hear them or needs to know them. That's a terrible thing about living in this 21st century, is that we have the ability to share our opinions with every single person around us. We need to show some discretion and be careful about those things. I just went on a rant for a couple of minutes and just about used up our time. Let's grab these last comments, and we'll have to stop here at number 11. A couple of comments that we have here. Stan Milor makes the statement, you should be willing to be defrauded or taken advantage of. That's a great point. Paul makes that statement in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 about how we ought to look at things. And that's a really important point. Luke 20. Exodus 22 is the passage about self-defense. I appreciate that, George. I was thinking 32, but 22 it sounds good. Here's an interesting thing Lamar says. He says the qualifications for elders of having good behavior, not violent, not quarrelsome, a good testimony among those outside, was seem to deny any physical violence by them. And again, Lamar, any physical violence, that might be right. It might be the case. You would wonder, Lamar, about somebody like Cornelius. As a Roman soldier, would he have been fit for that purpose? And it's a great question. I think your point is really good about those kinds of things. So it's kind of interesting. On the other hand, like I said, I can also see some characteristic that we're really describing the maturity in Christ too. But sure, I sure see what you're trying to say there, and that's a good point. Stephen Root says self-control is more than just physical, as stated in James. Yeah, controlling the mouth. That's right. Don't stir up controversy. Boy, I just can't say that enough. Don't be the person that says something that if you know this is going to offend some of you, a Christian would say, then I shouldn't say it. That's just something we need to think very, very carefully about. And we're at our time. I want to pick right up back here, talking about right after this one, gentle, verse 3, gentle, uncontentious, free from the love of money, not quarrelsome. Those are the next things I want to pick up as we continue on in this study. And again, what's really great about these things is that we're able to apply these things to ourselves. These characteristics, these qualifications are things that we're all striving in order to fulfill. We're wrapping up at this point. We appreciate your time, all the good things. I'd ask you to remember the Pecci family in your prayers. Terry has mentioned that his mother had to go to the hospital today, and so we want to keep her and him in our prayers, and we'd ask you to remember them this week. Praying, of course, always for the saints and for our leaders and the different things that we desire to do so that we might leave godly and peaceable lives among all men. Thanks so much for some fantastic comments and thoughts. Appreciate it. God bless you in this week.